The day they took him started like any other. The skies above Earth were a dull gray, heavy with the kind of clouds that promised rain but never delivered. I was stationed on orbital defense shift, watching the outer rings of satellites and automated guns when the alarms screamed across the comms. "Unknown signature, breaching perimeter." At first, I thought it was just another probe from the neighboring systems, some scavenger testing our defenses. But when the screens lit up, the shape wasn't anything I'd seen before. Not a ship designed for trade, nor war. Something sleek, elongated, almost alive. Before we could scramble half our interceptors, it slipped past our nets like a knife through water, and it went straight for him. Captain Daniel Rhodes. My friend, my commanding officer, the one man who'd held Earth's military together after the last war with the Coalition. He wasn't just a soldier, he was the man who carried Earth's pride in his voice, who reminded us in every battle that humanity wasn't to be broken. The aliens didn't fire on the city, didn't raise the bases, didn't demand surrender. They went for Rhodes, surgical, precise, like they'd studied us. One blinding flash of light, and he was gone. The ship vanished into dark space before our fighters could even lock on. The silence afterward was worse than the alarms. When news spread, Earth didn't mourn quietly. The streets filled with voices, people shouting, demanding blood. They took our captain. Bring him back. No man gets stolen from Earth. And for once, the politicians didn't argue. They didn't delay with debates. They looked into the cameras, and their faces burned with the same fury we all carried. An attack on Rhodes wasn't just an attack on a man. It was an attack on us all. I sat in that war council, shoulders tense, heart burning, as the order was given. Raise the Armada. Not a single ship, not a token force. Every battleship that could move, every carrier still functional, every gun that could be mounted on steel. We would gather them all. Humanity wasn't negotiating. Humanity wasn't pleading. We were coming. The months that followed were a storm of noise and fire. Shipyards burned their engines day and night, welding armor to old hulls, reviving forgotten warships from rusted dry docks. Men who had sworn never to fight again came back, grim-faced, strapping on uniforms that smelled of dust and oil. Even the civilians poured in, volunteers lining up in droves, desperate to be part of the Armada. Some called it madness, chasing a single man across the stars, spending billions in steel and blood for one life. But those were the voices of people who didn't understand Rhodes. He was more than a soldier. He was Earth's defiance made flesh. And the aliens, whoever they were, had to learn the price of touching what belonged to us. I remember standing in the hangar when the flagship was unveiled, the Resolute, a monster of steel, bristling with cannons, its engines humming like a storm about to break. She wasn't just built for war, she was built to carry vengeance. I signed my name to her crew without hesitation. And when we launched, the sight nearly broke me. Hundreds of ships rising from Earth's surface like a tide of metal. Their hulls gleamed under the pale sunlight, their engines roared in unison, and for the first time in my life, I felt humanity wasn't small anymore. We weren't prey. We weren't begging for scraps at the galaxy's table. We were a storm. The message was clear. They held one hostage. Earth raised an armada to bring him back, and God help anyone standing in our way. The stars stretched before us like a graveyard of lights, and every ship that burned into the void with us carried the weight of Earth's fury. I remember the hum of the engines, the constant vibration under my boots, and the voices of men and women speaking in low tones across the decks. We weren't explorers anymore. We were hunters. The Resolute led the way, her dark hull shimmering with the glow of distant suns. Behind her, cruisers and destroyers lined up in perfect formation, carriers brimming with fighters that sat in their bays like caged beasts, ready to strike. In all my years in the service, I had never seen such a sight. It wasn't just an armada, it was the embodiment of one truth. Humanity does not forgive. Admiral Hayden, our commanding officer, stood at the front of the bridge. A stone-faced man, gray at the temples, eyes sharp like they'd been carved from steel. He wasn't a man of speeches, but he didn't need to be. His silence carried more weight than words. He looked out at the fleet like a king surveying his kingdom, and all of us knew the fire in him matched our own. Our first destination was Sigma Dore, a cluster of barren worlds at the edge of the Orion Belt. Our intelligence division, scrambling for answers, had intercepted fragments of alien transmissions. They pointed to movements in that sector. Whispers of a species we had no official records on. That's where roads had been dragged. That's where we'd start tearing down walls. It took 2 weeks to reach the system, and those weeks were filled with training, drills, and silence. The mess halls buzzed with quiet conversations. No laughter, no boasting like you'd hear before any other campaign. This wasn't war for conquest or for politics. This was personal. Everyone knew that if they failed, roads would die, and Earth's pride would be broken forever. When we dropped into Sigma Dore, the scanners lit up with contacts almost immediately. Ships, dozens of them, sleek and curved, like shards of obsidian cutting through the void. The aliens had been waiting. The first salvo came before we could even hail them. Energy beams tore across space, smashing against our forward shields, shaking the Resolute from bow to stern. The alarms screamed, and the bridge erupted into shouts. "Shields holding at 80%! Enemy squadrons breaking formation, closing fast! Guns online, Admiral!" Hayden didn't flinch. He raised one hand, and his voice was calm as death. "Fire!" The Resolute's cannons thundered, streaks of plasma tearing through the void. The fleet opened up in unison, a wall of firepower that turned the darkness into a burning storm. Alien ships exploded, some spinning into debris, others splitting apart like paper under a knife. But they didn't scatter. They pressed in, tighter, bolder. They weren't fighting like raiders or mercenaries. They were fighting like zealots. I strapped into my station, hands flying across controls, feeding targeting solutions to the gunners. My console vibrated with every hit we took, my chest rattling with the echoes of war. Outside the viewport, the void was alive with fire, ships twisting, burning, fighters darting like hornets between giants of steel. For every alien vessel that went down, 2 more appeared, slipping out from behind the dead planets. They had numbers. We had rage. "Enemy cruiser on our starboard," someone shouted. "Bring the broadside to bear," Hayden snapped. The Resolute swung, her side guns lighting up, unleashing hell into the alien cruiser's hull. The ship shuddered, cracked, and erupted into flame. A cheer rose from the crew, but it died quickly as more enemy ships closed in. I caught a glimpse of their markings through the chaos, symbols etched into the alien hulls, glowing faintly with some kind of energy. Not military insignias, something older, ritualistic. And in that moment, it struck me. They hadn't come for Rhodes because of war or strategy. They'd taken him for something else, something darker. The battle raged for hours. By the time the last alien ship broke and fled into the void, leaving trails of burning wreckage behind, the Armada was bloodied, but alive. Dozens of our ships scarred, some torn apart, crews lost to the abyss. But the fleet stood. On the bridge, sweat ran down my face as I tore my headset off. My chest ached, not from wounds, but from the sheer pressure of what we'd just endured. The air smelled of ozone and burnt circuits. Reports came in. 3 destroyers gone, heavy losses on Ironclad and Remembrance. But Hayden wasn't looking at the reports. He was staring at the wreckage on the scanners, eyes narrowing. "Bring me the logs, any data we can pull from their systems." Hours later, the techs brought fragments of alien code, pulled from the shattered wreckage. I stood beside Hayden as the words scrolled across the screens, auto-translated by our systems. The language was broken, half garbled, but the meaning came through. Subject secured. Human captain viable. Ritual incomplete. Deliver to the keepers. The silence in the room was suffocating. It wasn't a ransom. It wasn't an interrogation. They had taken Rhodes for something far older than politics, some kind of ritual, some belief that demanded him. When Hayden spoke, his voice was ice. Plot a course to these keepers. I don't care where they hide. We'll burn through their gods if we have to. The hunt deepened. We chased their trails across 3 systems, fighting ambushes at every turn. Each battle scarred us more, took more of our brothers, but it also hardened us. Every time we lost a ship, the rage inside us grew. I watched men who had once doubted the mission, who whispered in the dark that no single man was worth this, turn into fanatics of their own. It wasn't just about Rhodes anymore. It was about proving a truth the galaxy had forgotten. Humanity doesn't bow. Humanity doesn't break. Humanity doesn't let its own be taken. 2 months into the campaign, we finally cornered one of their larger vessels in the Vela Rift. A massive carrier, surrounded by escorts, its hull glowing with runes that pulsed like veins. We hammered it with everything we had, shields flaring, armor peeling away until the beast cracked in half. We didn't let it die clean. We boarded it. I was part of the boarding team, rifle clenched in my hands as the breach charges blew open their corridors. The air was thick with smoke, the walls alive with strange symbols that shimmered as if mocking us. Alien warriors met us in the halls, tall, pale creatures with eyes like burning coals. Their weapons humming with energy. They fought like demons, but we were worse. We cut through them, our boots pounding, our breaths ragged, and in the heart of that ship we found the first clue. A chamber. Circular, lined with markings that pulsed with energy. In the center, a structure like an altar. And on it, chains. Human-sized chains. Rhodes had been here. One of the techs, a young kid with eyes wide in horror, whispered what we were all thinking. They're using him for something sacred. I ran my hand across the chains, the metal still warm, and swore under my breath. They hadn't just taken Rhodes to break Earth. They had taken him for some ritual, some twisted belief that required a man who embodied defiance. We pulled every scrap of data from that ship before blowing it apart. And when the pieces came together, the truth was worse than we imagined. The Keepers weren't just a faction. They were a cult, scattered across the stars, worshipping forces older than any empire. And they believed Rhodes was a key to waking something that had been asleep for millennia. Back on the Resolute, the crew gathered as Hayden delivered the news. His voice was steady, but I saw the shadow in his eyes. They think Rhodes is more than a man. They think he can open the way for something that should never wake. We're not just fighting for him now. We're fighting for Earth, for all of us. The room was silent, fists clenched, jaws tight. And in that silence, something changed. We weren't just an armada seeking vengeance anymore. We were humanity's sword against something that could devour everything we loved. I went back to my quarters that night, staring at the stars outside my small window, and I felt the weight pressing down. Rhodes was alive somewhere, suffering, chained by zealots who thought him divine. And if we failed, if we were too slow, he wouldn't just die. He'd be used to open a door we couldn't close. I clenched my fists until my knuckles cracked. They held one hostage, but Earth would burn their gods, their temples, their very stars to bring him back. And if they wanted a war of faith, we'd show them what humanity worships: the fire of survival, the fury of vengeance, the promise that no man is ever left behind. The further we pressed into alien space, the more the stars themselves seemed to turn hostile. Systems once charted as empty wastelands now bristled with hidden bases, outposts carved into asteroids, and fleets lying in wait. Every week was another battle, another graveyard left behind, another dozen names added to the lists that haunted our comms. But the Armada didn't stop. Couldn't stop. By then, the mission had grown into something larger than any of us expected. What had started as a hunt for Rhodes had become a holy war of our own, though we would never call it that. The Keepers wanted faith, symbols, blood. We wanted fire and steel, retribution that could scorch their entire existence out of the stars. Yet rage, no matter how sharp, bleeds when stretched too far. On the Resolute's bridge, Admiral Hayden's face grew more lined with every system we burned through. His voice stayed iron, but the silence afterward weighed heavier each day. He would stand with his hands clasped behind his back, staring at the tactical screens filled with red and green icons, his lips pressed tight as more red blinked out, one after another. We were losing ships, too many. Our carriers had begun rationing fighters, keeping them in reserve for only the most vital strikes. Some destroyers were patched together with scrap, their hulls glowing faintly where temporary shielding units barely held. Men and women ate cold rations and recycled water, slept in shifts, and didn't complain. But you could feel it in the air. Exhaustion. The kind that doesn't just drag down your body, but gnaws at your spirit. It was during one of those nights, in the mess hall, when I first heard the whispers. "We can't keep this up," one crewman muttered to another, pushing around a tray of half-warmed protein paste. "We've gone too far. This isn't about one man anymore. It's about their damn religion, their gods. And I don't think we win this war." The man across from him leaned forward, his eyes bloodshot, voice low but sharp. "Don't you dare say that. Rhodes isn't just one man. He's Earth. He's the reason we fight. You think we crawl back home and tell our families we left him to die? That's when we lose everything." Their argument simmered like a fuse waiting to spark, and I left before it caught fire. But I knew that talk wasn't rare anymore. For every crewman ready to burn the galaxy down, there was another staring at the growing lists of the dead, wondering if Rhodes, if anyone, was worth it. Admiral Hayden knew it too. At the next War Council, with commanders linked in from across the fleet, the debate finally spilled out in the open. The holotable lit the dark chamber with stars and red markers, outlining our path toward what intelligence called the Sanctum, the Keeper stronghold, where Rhodes was most likely being held. The Sanctum was buried deep in the Eridan Veil, a nebula thick with radiation storms and gravity wells that chewed navigation systems alive. One commander, a scar-faced veteran from the Ironclad, slammed his fist on the table. "With respect, Admiral, if we press into the Veil, half our ships won't make it through. We've already bled enough for this hunt. We've made our point. It's time we pulled back before we lose everything." A ripple of voices followed him, some in agreement, others in outrage. "Pull back and leave Rhodes? We're not leaving him, but we can't win if we're dead." "Cowards, if Rhodes were here, he'd spit on your weakness." The chamber shook with shouting until Hayden raised a hand. Silence crashed down. His eyes burned as he looked around the table. "You think this is about one man? Then you've been blind since the day we launched. They took Rhodes not for ransom, not for leverage, but because they believe he is a key to something none of us should ever want to see awakened. If we turn back now, we don't just abandon him. We abandon every world, every child, every future, because what comes after will not stop at Earth." His voice cut like a blade, but even then I saw it in their faces. The doubt, the fear. Men and women who had already buried too many of their crews. Hayden saw it too, but he didn't bend. He ended the meeting with a single line that echoed through my chest. Better we burn in the stars than crawl home and leave the galaxy to rot. And so we pushed on. The Eridan Veil wasn't just space. It was a nightmare. The nebula boiled around us, purple storms cracking with lightning that stretched across thousands of kilometers. Gravity wells pulled at our ships like claws, dragging us off course, forcing us to burn engines until they screamed. Radiation fried half our sensors, leaving us blind to what lay ahead. And that's when the Keepers struck. They came like wraiths, their ships phasing in and out of the radiation storms, black hulls glowing with runes that fed on the nebula itself. We barely saw them until their weapons were carving through our flanks, beams slicing into hulls, fighters vanishing into storms of plasma. On the Resolute, the bridge was chaos. Shields collapsing on the port side. Enemy boarding craft inbound. We're losing the Vanguard. She's breaking apart. I gripped my console, fingers flying as I fed coordinates to our gunners. The Resolute's cannons roared, lighting up the storm with fire, blasting Keeper ships into debris. But for everyone we killed, 2 more appeared. The nebula made long-range coordination impossible. Our fleet fractured, groups of ships fighting blind, cut off from one another. The screams over comms were filled with static, desperate calls for backup fading into silence as one ship after another was torn apart. I saw the Ironclad, the same commander who had argued against pressing forward, take a beam straight through her spine. The ship split, flames spilling into the void before the nebula swallowed her whole. No escape pods, no survivors. The rage in me burned hotter than the fear. My jaw clenched so hard it hurt, and I spat curses into the void. We couldn't stop. Not now. Not after everything. Hayden stood like a statue at the front, his voice steady even as the storm tore around us. Press forward, through the storm. All ships capable, follow the Resolute. Leave the dead behind. We carry the living to victory. Cold words, but necessary. Hours later, bloodied and burning, what remained of the Armada punched through the final wall of radiation and burst into open space again. We were fewer now, dozens of ships gone, thousands of lives scattered across the void. But before us, silhouetted against the dying light of a star, loomed the Sanctum. It wasn't a station. It wasn't even a fortress in the traditional sense. It was a world. A massive planetoid, carved hollow and ringed with structures that glowed with the same runes we had seen again and again. Towers reached into space like claws, energy arcing between them, feeding into the heart of the world itself. It looked less like a place built for war, and more like a shrine, one dedicated to something far larger, far hungrier than us. Silence filled the bridge as we gazed upon it. Even the most hardened soldiers, the ones who had sneered at faith and gods, couldn't help but feel the weight pressing down from that sight. And then the sensors lit up. An entire fleet, hundreds of Keeper ships, waiting in the shadow of the Sanctum. Their formation was perfect, their numbers overwhelming. This was no ambush, no scattered resistance. This was the heart of their faith, the full force of their belief, and they had gathered every blade to protect it. The bridge lights flickered as if the Resolute herself felt the dread. I looked to Hayden, waiting for orders. He didn't speak at first. He just stared at the Sanctum, his face carved in stone. Then, finally, he said, "Signal the fleet. This is it. Everything we are, everything we've lost. It all comes to this. Either we tear that shrine down and take roads back, or we die trying. There is no third option." The comms officer sent the message. Moments later, voices came back from the other ships, hoarse, tired, but burning with the same fire. No surrender. For roads. For Earth. The Armada reformed into lines, battered hulls glowing, weapons charging. The keepers moved to meet us, their runes burning brighter, their ships like shadows ready to consume the light. And in that moment, staring at the coming storm, I felt both dread and pride. Dread at the scale of what we were about to face. Pride that despite everything, the deaths, the doubt, the storms, the endless bleeding, we were still here, still standing, still ready to throw ourselves against the impossible. They held one hostage, but Earth had brought an armada to burn their faith to ash. The final battle was about to begin. The void had never felt so alive. Across the bridge of the Resolute, silence hung heavy, broken only by the thrum of the engines and the low hum of weapons charging. Ahead, the sanctum loomed like a god's tomb, its towers bleeding light into the darkness, the runes along its surface pulsing like a heartbeat. Around it swarmed the Keeper fleet, hundreds of ships in formation, their obsidian hulls glinting, their runes glowing brighter with each passing second. They weren't defending territory. They were defending faith, and they were ready to die for it. Admiral Hayden stood at the prow of the bridge, shoulders squared, hands behind his back, eyes locked on the enemy like a predator sighting prey. No speeches this time, no words to stir men's hearts. We didn't need them. Every man and woman in the fleet already knew the truth. This was it. Either we smashed the sanctum and dragged Rhodes back, or we died here and humanity's defiance died with us. "Signal all ships," Hayden said, his voice low but ironclad. "Attack pattern Omega. No hesitation." The comms officer nodded, relaying the order. Across the fleet, battered destroyers and scarred carriers adjusted course, weapons flaring as one. The void crackled with energy. Then, the Keepers moved. Their fleet surged forward like a tidal wave, runes flaring, engines screaming through the silence of space. Hundreds of black hulls against our hundreds of steel warships, colliding in the greatest storm of fire the stars had ever seen. Fire! The Resolute shuddered as her forward cannons erupted, lancing beams of plasma that ripped through the void and tore the first wave of Keeper ships to pieces. The rest of the fleet followed. Missiles, torpedoes, railguns, beams, all unleashed in one cataclysmic barrage. Alien vessels burned, split, and exploded, but they didn't falter. They pressed in, their own weapons answering, streaks of crimson light and bursts of energy slamming into our ships, peeling armor away like paper. The void became chaos. I gripped my console, feeding targeting solutions to our gunners, sweat stinging my eyes. The tactical screen was a storm of red and green, icons flashing out with each death scream across comms. The hull shook as another blast ripped into us, shields flaring before holding, barely. "Port shields down to 60%. Enemy bombers inbound. The Hammerfall is gone. She's breaking apart." The enemy came in waves, fighters swarming like hornets, latching onto hulls and drilling into ships to spill boarding parties. Reports of hand-to-hand fighting filled the comms, screams of men holding the line in corridors painted red. On the bridge, Hayden didn't flinch. His eyes burned like twin stars. "Bring us closer to the sanctum. Keepers want to fight for their gods? Then let's bleed them at their altar." The Resolute surged forward, flanked by what remained of the heavy cruisers. Our guns thundered, tearing through another Keeper vessel that tried to block the way. The sanctum grew larger in the viewport, its towers arcing with energy, the glow so bright it looked alive. And then it hit us. A pulse, not from their fleet, but from the sanctum itself. The runes flared, and a wave of energy slammed across space, rippling through shields and tearing systems apart. Consoles sparked, men cried out, ships staggered in formation. 3 destroyers simply exploded as their reactors went critical under the pulse. The comms lit with screams. "They're using the sanctum as a weapon," one officer shouted. Hayden's jaw clenched. "Then we cut the heart out of it. Launch boarding parties. We're taking that shrine apart from the inside." The order rippled across the fleet. Dropships and gunboats poured out from our carriers, racing through the firestorm toward the Sanctum's towers. The Keeper fleet tried to stop them, swarms of fighters diving into the chaos, but our men pushed through, weaving between flares of plasma and bursts of shrapnel. I wasn't staying behind this time. I strapped on my rifle, armor clamping into place, heart pounding as I joined the boarding team. The dropship rattled violently as we cut through the storm. The pilot cursed under his breath, weaving between streaks of fire. Around me, men checked weapons, faces pale but eyes set. None of us spoke. Words had no meaning now. The Sanctum grew massive in the viewport, a wall of black stone and glowing runes stretching endlessly. Our dropship slammed onto the surface, magnetic clamps locking us down. The ramp dropped, and we stormed out into hell. The surface of the Sanctum was alive with fire. Explosions erupted across the hull as other dropships landed, soldiers pouring out into enemy fire. The Keepers were waiting. Tall, pale figures in black armor, their eyes glowing with the same light as the runes, their weapons shrieking with unnatural energy. They weren't soldiers in the way we understood. They were zealots, and they fought like demons. The first volley cut 2 men down beside me, their bodies crumpling without a sound. I returned fire, my rifle kicking against my shoulder. The alien zealot's head bursting in a spray of light and ash. We pushed forward, step by brutal step, laying down fire, grenades tearing craters into the Sanctum's surface. "Push to the towers," our commander roared. "We take the generators, we bring this thing down!" We charged, bullets and beams tearing through the chaos. The Sanctum's surface trembled beneath us, energy arcing through the runes, lightning splitting the sky above. Around us the battle raged in every direction, dropships exploding, Keeper warriors throwing themselves into suicidal charges, humans screaming as blades of light cut through armor. And then we breached the first tower. The doors exploded inward, and we stormed inside, rifles raised. The air was thick, not with smoke, but with something heavier. A pressure that pressed against your skull, made your chest tight. The walls glowed faintly, covered in symbols that seemed to shift when you weren't looking. We fought through corridors slick with alien markings, each room filled with more zealots ready to die for their gods. But they weren't just dying, they were chanting. Even as we cut them down, their voices echoed, a low, guttural hymn that shook the walls. Deeper and deeper we pushed, blood painting the black stone beneath our boots. And then we found it. The chamber. It was vast, circular, the walls carved with runes that pulsed like veins. In the center stood a monolithic altar, energy crackling around it and chained to it. Broken, bloodied, but alive, was Captain Daniel Rhodes. I froze. For a heartbeat, the war vanished. All I saw was him, arms outstretched, chains burning against his skin, his face pale but his eyes still alive. His gaze lifted, locking on mine, and even across the chaos I saw it, the defiance still burning there. "Rhodes!" someone shouted. The Keepers surged from the shadows, more zealots than we had bullets for. They poured into the chamber, chanting louder, their weapons screaming. We fought like men possessed, rifles spitting fire, grenades tearing through the mass, blades clashing in the dark. I fought my way forward step by bloody step toward Rhodes. My chest burned, my arms shook, my rifle overheated, but I didn't stop. None of us did. I reached the altar, slamming my rifle into its chains, sparks flying as I tried to cut them loose. Rhodes's lips cracked into a faint smile, blood dripping down his face. His voice was hoarse, but the words carried strength. "You came." "Of course we did," I spat, tearing at the chains. "You're not dying here." But even as I spoke, The runes around us flared brighter. The altar pulsed, energy building like a storm about to break. The chanting of the keepers rose into a frenzy, their voices shaking the chamber, and in that moment, I understood. This wasn't just about Rhodes. He wasn't just a hostage. He was the final piece of their ritual, and by bringing the Armada here, by bringing humanity's fury to their shrine, we had given them exactly what they wanted. Blood, fire, sacrifice. The sanctum was waking something, and we were already too late to stop it. The chamber shook like the heart of a dying star. Every rune across its black stone walls burned brighter with each passing second, casting the air in a sickly red glow that made the keepers' pale faces gleam like skulls. Their chant thundered louder, 1,000 voices echoing down the sanctum's endless halls, merging into a single guttural hymn that clawed its way into my skull. And there, chained at the altar, was Rhodes. His body was battered, clothes torn, blood running down his arms where the shackles cut into flesh. But his eyes burned with something no amount of torture could kill. Defiance. He looked at us not as broken soldiers or fools too late, but as his brothers who had finally come. "You came," he rasped again, his voice hoarse but steady. "Not leaving you here," I growled, my hands shaking as I tore at the chains, rifle clattering against the unholy steel. Sparks flew, but the bindings didn't break. They weren't just chains. They pulsed with the same runes carved into the walls, alive with the sanctum's power. Behind us, the firefight raged. My squad clashed with wave after wave of keeper zealots, their screams mingling with gunfire. Blood streaked the black stone floor, grenades thumped, rifles shrieked, men shouted curses as alien blades clashed against human steel. But no matter how many zealots we cut down, more poured in, their faith unshaken, their eyes burning like firebrands. The ground itself began to rumble, a low vibration that rattled through my boots, through my bones, into my teeth. The altar flared brighter. Something beneath the sanctum was waking. Rhodes coughed, blood staining his lips, and forced the words out through clenched teeth. "You don't understand. They're not just zealots. They're opening it." "Opening what?" I demanded, panic prickling my spine. His eyes locked on mine, and in them I saw something I had never seen in him before. Not fear for himself, but fear for us. An old hunger. They think I'm the key, that a human will open the gate. Before I could answer, the runes across the altar burst into blinding light. The entire chamber shook, and the chanting of the zealots reached a frenzy. Their voices cracked with ecstasy as the air rippled, bending and distorting. The altar wasn't just stone anymore. It was a wound, a fissure, something pulling at reality itself. My rifle nearly flew from my grip as a wave of force blasted outward. Several men were thrown against the walls, their bodies snapping with the impact. The zealots only pressed harder, their chants now screams of devotion, their blades dripping with the blood of those who fell. I roared, slamming my shoulder against Rhodes's chains, trying to break them. They didn't budge. My hands bled as I clawed at them, cursing, begging, raging. "Hold them back!" our commander shouted, his voice barely audible over the chaos. "Buy time!" But time was slipping, through the storm of fire and blood. Rhodes spoke again, his voice quieter, as if he was already somewhere else. "They needed me alive, because I fought them, because I wouldn't break. They believe humanity's defiance will open the way." And I understood then. The keepers hadn't chosen Rhodes at random. They hadn't taken him as a hostage of convenience. They had taken the one man who embodied our refusal to kneel, our refusal to be broken, and chained him as the key to awaken something older than any of us. The sanctum wasn't a fortress. It was a lock, and Rhodes was the key. Suddenly, the comms in my ear exploded with static, then the panicked voices of our fleet. "Enemy reinforcements incoming, thousands of ships! The Guardian is down. We're losing the line. God help us. The sanctum's tearing itself open. I staggered back, staring as a rift began to split open in the air above the altar. Black, searing, endless. Not space as we knew it, not vacuum, but something deeper. A void behind the void. Shapes moved within it. Massive, indistinct, writhing forms that my mind refused to comprehend. My eyes watered, my stomach churned. I knew, without knowing how, that this was not life. It was hunger given shape. And the zealots screamed in ecstasy, raising their arms toward it. I slammed my rifle butt into Rhodes's chains again, sparks flying, my throat raw from screaming. We're not letting them take you, do you hear me? He met my eyes again, and this time, there was no defiance, only grim acceptance. You can't stop it by freeing me. The words hit like a blade in my chest. The commander grabbed my arm, dragging me back as another wave of zealots poured in. We're being overrun. We have to fall back. No, I shouted, pulling against him. Not without Rhodes. But Rhodes shook his head. If you stay, you die for nothing. Tell Hayden. Tell him the sanctum isn't the end. It's just the door. The rift above the altar widened, the blackness spilling outward. Tendrils of darkness lashing against the walls, burning holes into stone. One brushed a zealot, and the alien screamed, not in pain, but in bliss, before disintegrating into ash. The others only chanted louder. I felt the heat of it on my skin, though it was no heat I could name. It was emptiness, hunger, devouring. We fired wildly into the zealots, cutting them down as we fell back, step by bloody step. My eyes never left Rhodes, chained to the altar, bathed in the light of a nightmare. His lips moved one last time, and though I couldn't hear the words, I read them. Go. The commander dragged me out of the chamber as the rift screamed open, the sound like worlds shattering. The last thing I saw before the doors sealed behind us was Rhodes, defiant to the end. Chained against the storm as if daring the abyss itself to break him. Outside, the battle was breaking apart. The Keeper fleet had multiplied, their reinforcements spilling from hidden rifts across the nebula, their numbers overwhelming. Our Armada, already bloodied, was collapsing under the storm. Ships that had stood against impossible odds for months were breaking apart one by one, torn into debris that spun silently into the void. The Resolute still fought, her cannons tearing holes through alien hulls, but her shields flickered, her armor cracked. Hayden's voice boomed across comms, steady even as the galaxy burned. All ships, focus fire on the sanctum. If it wakes, none of us live. Hit it with everything you have. The fleet obeyed. Hundreds of weapons turned on the sanctum, beams and torpedoes slamming into its surface. Towers shattered, runes flickered, explosions ripped craters into its black stone. But still it pulsed, still the rift widened, still the hunger spilled outward. Inside my dropship, we raced back across the sanctum's surface, dodging fire, dragging wounded men with us. My chest heaved, my mind reeling with Rhodes's words. The sanctum wasn't the end, just the door. And the door was opening. As we lifted off, I looked back one last time. The sanctum cracked like an egg, entire sections collapsing inward as the rift grew. Shapes pressed against it from the other side, shapes too large, too wrong to exist. The zealots screamed in worship as their world tore itself apart. We broke through the atmosphere just as another wave of energy blasted outward, tearing through both fleets alike. Ships on both sides disintegrated, their hulls ripping apart under the force. The Resolute staggered but held, her engines burning bright as she poured fire into the heart of the sanctum. The comms were chaos, shouts, screams, orders, prayers. And then silence, The sanctum imploded. A blinding light tore across the void, swallowing the rift, the zealots, the world itself. Our ships staggered as the shockwave hit, throwing us across space like leaves in a storm. I clung to the straps of my seat, teeth rattling, vision white. When the light faded, the sanctum was gone. Nothing remained but debris. Black stone shards floating in silence, runes flickering and dying. The rift had closed. But Rhodes was gone with it. Back on the Resolute, the survivors gathered in silence. Hayden stood at the center of the bridge. His face like granite, his eyes hollow. No one spoke. No one could. We had destroyed the sanctum. We had closed the rift. But we hadn't brought Rhodes home. The Admiral's voice finally broke the silence. He bought us time, that's all. The Keepers won't stop. The sanctum was just their first shrine. There will be more. His words were a blade twisting in my gut, but I knew they were true. Rhodes had been sacrificed not because he was weak, but because he was strong. And though we had destroyed their altar, the hunger they worshipped was still out there, waiting. I clenched my fists until my nails cut my palms. They had taken one man. We had raised an armada, but even an armada wasn't enough to erase the hunger that had stirred. The war wasn't over. It had only begun. We limped home like a wounded beast. The armada that had left Earth in thunder and steel returned in silence, its ships broken, its crews hollow. Of the hundreds of vessels that had risen from our shipyards months ago, barely a third crossed back into Sol space. Their hulls were torn, their engines scarred, some held together with nothing but patchwork plating and stubborn will. The skies of Earth filled with their shadows, but the cheers that had greeted our departure did not rise again. Cities fell silent as our ships descended. Families lined the streets, waiting for faces that would never walk down those ramps. I remember stepping off the dropship, the weight of ash still clinging to my armor, and seeing the crowd. Thousands stood there, holding banners, clutching photographs, their eyes burning with desperate hope. When they saw us return without Rhodes, that hope cracked. Whispers spread before words could. They failed. He's gone. We lost him. And then came the harder questions. If they couldn't save Rhodes, what hope do we have? We had gone to bring a man back. Instead, we had brought back loss. Admiral Hayden called the surviving commanders into council within hours of landing. The chamber smelled of sweat and iron, the air heavy with grief. Hollow screens displayed casualty numbers, ship losses, supply reports. Each line was a dagger. The Resolute had survived, but barely. The Guardian, the Ironclad, the Hammerfall, the Remembrance, names that once carried pride were now ashes in the void. Tens of thousands dead, hundreds of thousands more unaccounted for, presumed lost in the sanctum's implosion. And Rhodes. His name hung over us heavier than all the rest. The council fractured before the first report ended. One commander slammed his fist against the table, his eyes bloodshot. We went to bring him back. That was the mission. And he's dead. We sacrificed half our fleet for nothing. Another shot to his feet, shouting back. Nothing? We destroyed the sanctum. We closed their rift. If Rhodes gave his life for that, then it was worth every ship, every man. Voices erupted, some calling Rhodes a martyr, others calling his death proof that Earth had overreached. Hayden stood in silence at the head of the table, his jaw locked, letting the fury burn itself out. When the shouting finally died, his voice filled the room like steel drawn from a sheath. Daniel Rhodes is dead. The words silenced us. They were heavy, final, spoken without hesitation. Hayden's gaze swept across the table. But he did not die for nothing. He did not die because we failed him. He died because he chose to stand against something none of us yet understand. He gave us time to prepare for what is coming." A commander sneered. "Prepare? We've gutted our fleet. We have nothing left." Hayden leaned forward, his voice dropping into a growl. "Then we build again, stronger, smarter. The Keepers have more shrines, more sanctums. They will not stop, and if we wait, if we wallow in grief, then Rhodes's death will be for nothing. The hunger he held back will devour us all." No one argued after that, not because they agreed, but because there was nothing left to say. The days that followed were the darkest I had ever seen. Earth buried its dead, though many graves held no bodies, only names carved into stone. The streets were filled with funerals, black flags fluttering, the sound of mourning drowning out the hum of the cities. Families cursed us, spat at uniforms, screamed that their sons and daughters had died for a man who never came home. I couldn't blame them. In my own quarters, I sat staring at Rhodes's face on a faded photograph. It had been taken years ago during the war with the Coalition, back when we thought our enemies were mortal, not gods. He was smiling in that picture. Rhodes never smiled much, but when he did, it was the kind of smile that told you nothing in the galaxy could break him. And now he was gone. Every night I heard his last words echo in my skull. The sanctum isn't the end. It's just the door. What had he seen in those months of captivity? What had he endured, chained to that altar, listening to their chants, staring into that abyss? He hadn't just been warning us. He had been begging us to understand. And we still didn't. Weeks passed, and Earth tried to move forward. Factories reopened, shipyards began hammering steel again, though the rhythm was slower, more strained. Politicians stood in front of cameras, speaking of sacrifice, unity, and honor, but their voices were thin compared to the roar of grief rising from the streets. The cracks grew wider. In the barracks, soldiers muttered in corners. Some said Rhodes's death proved we had no place in the stars, that humanity should retreat to its cradle and never look outward again. Others argued the opposite, that we hadn't gone far enough. That if we had burned the galaxy sooner, harder, Rhodes would have lived. I walked among them, listening, never speaking. I didn't know which side was right. Admiral Hayden kept to his office most days, buried in reports, speaking only when necessary. But when he did emerge, his words carried the same fire they always had. "The Keepers are not gods," he said once to a gathering of troops. "They are zealots, and zealots can be killed. Remember that." Some cheered. Others stared in silence. One night, unable to sleep, I walked through the docks. The skeletons of new warships were rising from the scaffolds, their frames glowing under welding sparks. Children of the old Armada built on the bones of the dead. And as I walked, I saw her. A woman in her 40s, face lined with grief, standing alone at the edge of the docks. In her hands was a small, hollow projector, flickering with the face of a young man. Her son, no doubt, one of the thousands we had left in the stars. She stared at it, unmoving, her lips whispering words I couldn't hear. I turned away before she noticed me. The guilt was heavier than any armor I had ever worn. That was when I realized. The war had scarred more than our fleet. It had scarred our souls. But grief has a way of turning to steel. Months later, when the first of the new ships were christened, the crowds returned. Not with cheers this time, but with grim silence. They watched the warships rise like tombstones, their names carved not for glory, but for memory. Rhodes's legacy, the fallen, the ashes of Sigma. This wasn't triumph, it was defiance, and in that defiance, humanity found its path again. The council met again when intelligence brought word of another shrine. This one hidden in the Persid cluster, its signals faint but unmistakable. Another sanctum, Another rift waiting to be torn open. The room was quiet when Hayden spoke. We cannot wait. We cannot mourn forever. If we do, the keepers will open more doors. And one day we won't be able to close them. No one argued, not because they believed him, but because belief no longer mattered. Survival did. That night, I returned to my quarters and sat staring at Rhodes's photograph again. I thought of his voice, his eyes, his defiance even in chains. And for the first time since he died, I didn't feel only grief. I felt rage. Not the blind rage of battle, but the kind that runs cold, the kind that stays. Rhodes was gone. We couldn't bring him back. But we could carry him. We could make sure his death wasn't the spark of our end, but the fire that forged us harder than the stars themselves. The keepers thought they had taken the symbol of our defiance and used him as a key. They didn't understand. Defiance doesn't die with one man. It spreads. They held one hostage. But in taking him, they had awakened something else. All of us. The next campaign would not be about rescue. It would not be about one man. It would be about vengeance. It would be about survival. And this time we would not fight to save a life. We would fight to end a faith. The second Armada didn't rise with cheers. There were no banners waving, no children perched on their fathers' shoulders, no parades flooding the streets. The launches were quiet, almost funeral-like. Families stood behind barriers, their faces pale, their eyes hollow. Some wept, some spat. But most said nothing. They had given us their sons and daughters once, and we had returned with ashes. Now we were taking them again, not for Rhodes this time, not for a single man, but for a war few of them truly understood. And yet, they didn't stop us. Humanity's anger had curdled into something else. Grim inevitability. We were going back to the stars not as saviors, not even as soldiers, but as executioners. The Perseid cluster was waiting. The fleet had been rebuilt, but it was a scarred reflection of its former self. The Resolute still led, patched and reinforced, her hull darkened by the wounds of the Sanctum. Around her, new warships gleamed fresh from the shipyards, their names sharp reminders of what we had lost. Ironclad's Ghost, Hammerfall's Wrath, Rhodes' Legacy. Each ship was less a vessel and more a tombstone sailing into war. I walked her decks as we left Earth's orbit again, and the men's faces told me everything. They were harder now, sharper, not fresh recruits, but survivors and replacements who had been forged in the fire of grief. They didn't speak of victory or glory. They spoke of vengeance. The mess halls were quiet. The barracks were silent except for the hum of machinery. Even laughter had become rare, as though the sound no longer belonged among us. Rhodes's ghost lingered in every corridor. His name was painted on bulkheads, etched into armor, whispered in prayer before battle drills. He was no longer just a man. He had become the spine of our rage. Admiral Hayden was different, too. The man who had once stood like stone now carried something heavier in his eyes. He didn't pace the bridge as before, didn't scowl at reports. He spoke less, moved slower, but when he gave orders, his voice carried the weight of inevitability. There was no more fire, only iron. I caught him alone once, staring out the viewport at the stars, his reflection pale in the glass. "They think Rhodes was a key," he said quietly, not turning to me. "Maybe they're right. But they don't understand. His death unlocked something too. Something in us." He turned then, and though his eyes were tired, they burned. "And now we'll show them what that means." It took 3 months to reach the Perseid cluster. 3 months of silence, drills, and waiting. By the time we dropped into the system, every man was wound tight as a trigger. The cluster itself was a graveyard of stars, gas clouds thick as oceans, planets shattered into debris, radiation storms crackling like lightning across the void. And there, hidden in the heart of it, was the second sanctum. It wasn't a world this time. It was a structure, an artificial construct, massive and angular, suspended within the gas clouds. A black spire that stretched for kilometers, wrapped in runes that glowed faintly like veins beneath diseased skin. Energy pulsed from its core, spreading through the clouds like a heartbeat. The moment our scanners locked onto it, the alarms screamed. "Contacts! Multiple fleets inbound!" The keepers were waiting. Dozens of their ships poured from the gas clouds, their runes flaring, their formations sharp. Not as many as we had faced at the first sanctum, but enough to bleed us dry if we faltered. Hayden stood at the prow of the bridge, his voice steady. "No hesitation. Break them, then burn their shrine." The Resolute's guns lit the void, followed by the fury of the fleet. Plasma and railfire tore through the Persid clouds, turning them into burning storms. Alien vessels split, flames spewing into the gas before vanishing into nothingness. But the Keepers didn't scatter. They came straight at us, screaming through the void, weapons carving into our shields. Fighters swarmed like hornets, latching onto hulls, drilling, spilling zealots into our decks. I fought in the corridors again, rifle bucking against my shoulder as I cut down one pale zealot after another. Their eyes glowed with fanatic fire, their blades shrieking against steel, their voices chanting even as they bled out. They didn't fear death, they welcomed it. And the sanctum pulsed. Every few minutes the spire flared, sending waves of energy across the cluster. Our ships staggered under it, systems flickering, shields collapsing. The Keepers fought harder every time it pulsed, as though the sanctum itself was feeding them. The battle raged for hours. Both fleets bled, debris scattering through the clouds, fire painting the void. And finally the Keepers began to break. One by one, their ships peeled away, fleeing into the gas. Our fleet surged forward, battering their retreat, driving them back towards the spire. Hayden's voice boomed across the comms. "Focus fire on the sanctum, tear it apart!" Our guns turned, plasma and torpedoes slamming into the spire's surface. Black stone shattered, runes flickered, towers cracked and collapsed. The sanctum screamed, the sound vibrating through the void, clawing at our ears even through steel and vacuum. But as it broke, something else awoke. The runes across the spire flared white-hot, brighter than any star. The gas clouds churned, lightning splitting the void. And for a heartbeat, I saw it. Through the smoke, through the storm, shapes pressing against the walls of reality, massive, writhing, impossible, just like before. My chest went cold. "It's opening again." The comms exploded with voices. Panic laced with fury. Hayden didn't flinch. "Boarding teams, now! If the shrine lives, it will open. We finish it from within." I was already running. We slammed onto the spire's surface, breaching charges, tearing its black stone open. Inside, the air was thicker than the last sanctum, heavy with a pressure that made my teeth ache. The corridors were carved with shifting runes, the walls pulsing like veins, the floor slick with something dark. The zealots met us in force, blades and rifles shrieking, their chants echoing through the halls. We cut through them, boots pounding, rifles blazing, grenades tearing their bodies apart. But no matter how many fell, more came. Deeper and deeper we pushed, the walls shaking, the runes burning, the air filled with the sound of their hymn, and beneath it, a deeper sound, a heartbeat, not mechanical, not natural, something else. We reached the central chamber, and my blood ran cold. Another altar, smaller than the last, but pulsing with the same light, and chained upon it, not roads, but others, humans, dozens of them, soldiers, civilians, even children, all shackled, their bodies thin, their eyes vacant. The zealots had been taking more than Rhodes. They had been taking us all along. And this was not the first shrine. It was one of many. The realization hit like a blade in my gut. Rhodes had been right. The sanctum wasn't the end. It was just the door. And the keepers had more keys than we ever imagined. We tore into the chamber, cutting down the zealots, blasting the altar. I rushed to the chains, ripping at them, freeing whoever I could. The prisoners collapsed, weak, broken, whispering nonsense, their minds shattered by whatever rituals they had endured. The altar screamed, the runes flaring. Another rift began to tear open above it, black and endless. Hayden's voice came through the comms, raw with rage. "Destroy it! Now!" We planted charges, firing everything we had into the altar, tearing the runes apart. The chamber shook, fire spilling through the cracks. The rift shrieked as it collapsed, the shapes within thrashing before vanishing into nothingness. The spire imploded behind us as we fled, the charges ripping it apart. Explosions tore through its veins, towers collapsing into the clouds. The Perseid sanctum died screaming, fire consuming it until nothing remained but ash. We returned to the Resolute, bloodied, broken, but alive. And with us, we carried the prisoners, children, soldiers, families. Proof that the keepers weren't just after Rhodes. Proof that they had been hunting humanity itself. Back on the bridge, Hayden stood over them, his face pale as he listened to their shattered whispers. Most could say little, but the fragments were enough. "There are more shrines," one woman croaked. "Hundreds, thousands." The silence that followed was heavier than any funeral. We hadn't saved Rhodes. We hadn't even ended the sanctums. We had only found the edge of something far larger. Hayden finally spoke, his voice like iron. "Then we burn every shrine, every spire, every altar, until the keepers have nothing left to worship." The crew erupted in grim silence. Fists clenched, jaws tight. We weren't saviors anymore. We were executioners. And this war was far from over. The war didn't end in Perseid. It began there. The survivors carried the proof in their eyes, their hollow voices whispering of shrines scattered across the stars, of altars carved on forgotten worlds, of rifts that pulsed in silence, waiting to open. The keepers weren't building one door to the abyss. They were building thousands, and humanity had no choice but to burn every last one. The Armada grew again, forged in fire and grief. Shipyards thundered day and night, steel rising into the skies like tombstones, each vessel christened with the names of the dead. New recruits poured in, not hopeful youths anymore, but grim men and women who had buried fathers, brothers, children. Every one of them came with rage in their hearts and defiance in their eyes. We didn't fight for Rhodes anymore. We fought because Rhodes had been the first. We fought because we understood, at last, that this war would decide not just Earth's survival, but the galaxy's. Admiral Hayden's speeches became fewer, but sharper. He stood before the fleet once, his voice carried across every ship, his face cold as stone. They believe faith is stronger than steel. They believe zeal will outlast fury, but they have never faced humanity when it refuses to bow. We will burn their shrines. We will slaughter their zealots. And we will drag their gods screaming into the dark. This war will not end until the keepers are nothing but ash. And we believed him. The third campaign was unlike anything before. We didn't march on one shrine. We marched on dozens, splitting the fleet into waves, tearing through systems like wildfire. The void filled with wreckage as keeper ships broke under our cannons, their zealots silenced by our blades. Each shrine was different. Some carved into dead moons, others built into asteroid belts, others floating like black monoliths in the void. But everyone pulsed with the same runes, the same hunger, and everyone died screaming beneath our fire. But the cost was endless. The keepers never surrendered. They never retreated without clawing us bloody. Every shrine became a battlefield, every system another graveyard. We lost ships with every battle, names blinking out on the tactical screens, friends vanishing in fire and silence. I fought on 5 shrines myself, my armor scarred, my rifle never cold. I killed men and monsters alike, zealots who laughed as they bled, who chanted even as my bullets tore them apart. And still, when I closed my eyes, I saw Rhodes chained to that altar, daring the abyss itself to break him. His ghost drove us forward. The final campaign came at last, in the farthest reaches of the Orion Rift. Intelligence had pieced together fragments of Keeper transmissions, whispers of a great sanctum, the heart of their faith. Not a shrine, not a spire, a world. When the fleet dropped into the rift, the sight froze my blood. It wasn't a planet as we knew it. It was a hollowed husk of a world, vast and black, its surface carved with runes so large they stretched across continents, glowing like veins of fire. Towers rose into the void, energy arcing between them, feeding into a storm at its core, and around it, an armada, not hundreds of ships. Thousands! The full strength of the Keepers gathered for one purpose, to defend their god. The void lit with fire before Hayden even spoke. Forward! The Resolute surged, her cannons screaming, the fleet behind her unleashing hell. The void became a storm of plasma and blood, ships tearing into one another, debris scattering like bones across the stars. I watched ships I knew, Rhodes' Legacy, Hammerfall's Wrath, Ashes of Sigma, burn and break, their names erased in silence, but there was no stopping, no retreat. This wasn't war anymore. This was extermination. The Resolute broke through the first wave, her guns ripping Keeper vessels apart, her armor cracking under their fury. Hayden stood at the prow, his face lit by fire, his voice calm even as the galaxy burned. Boarding teams, to the surface, end this. I was among them again. The great sanctum was hell-made stone. We stormed its surface under fire, breaching towers carved with runes larger than buildings. Inside, the air was thick, alive with whispers that pressed into your skull, making your vision blur. The zealots were everywhere, chanting, screaming, hurling themselves into our guns. We fought room by room, hall by hall, our boots slipping on blood, our rifles glowing red with heat. And all the while, the ground shook with the heartbeat of something deeper, something waiting. We reached the core at last. A chamber vast as a city, its walls carved with runes that pulsed like fire, its ceiling open to the void. And there, chained to altars by the hundreds, were humans, prisoners, men, women, children, soldiers. The Keepers had been harvesting us, dragging us from colonies, from ships, from battlefields. Rhodes had been the first, but not the last. The sight nearly broke me, but Hayden's voice carried like thunder. Free them, and burn the rest. We tore into the zealots with fury I didn't know I still had. My rifle kicked, grenades thundered. Blades clashed. I ripped chains apart, dragged prisoners free, shoved rifles into their hands. Some were too broken to fight. Others took the weapons with shaking hands and joined us, screaming with rage. And above us the rift tore open, the great sanctum pulsed, the runes flaring white-hot. The ceiling split, reality itself bending, and through it I saw them. Not gods, not demons, something worse, shapes too vast to name, writhing in the abyss, their presence alone burning my eyes. Hunger, pure and endless. The zealots screamed with joy. Hayden didn't falter. Charges. Now. We planted explosives across the chamber, slamming them into stone, into runes, into the altar itself. The ground shook, The rift widening, the abyss pressing closer, and then the charges blew. The chamber erupted, towers collapsing, runes shattering. The rift screamed as it imploded, the shapes within thrashing, clawing, vanishing into nothingness. The great sanctum tore itself apart. We fled as the world cracked, fire consuming its surface, the void filling with debris. Our dropships blasted free just as the planet imploded, collapsing into itself. A black hole swallowing the shrine and everything around it. The Keeper fleet broke. For the first time, they faltered, their ships scattering, their zealots silent. The war wasn't won, but it had shifted. Back on the Resolute, silence hung heavy. The survivors were bloodied, broken, their faces pale. But in their eyes, for the first time, I saw something else. Hope. We hadn't destroyed the Keepers entirely. There would be more shrines, more battles, more blood. But we had burned their heart. We had shown them that their gods could bleed. Hayden stood before us one last time, his voice carrying across the fleet. We came for one man. We lost him. But we found ourselves. This war will not end today. It may not end in our lifetimes, but it will end. And when it does, the galaxy will remember one truth: humanity does not kneel. The cheers that followed weren't joyous. They were defiant, raw, torn from throats cracked by grief. And I felt Rhodes's ghost there with us, chained no longer, but standing in every soldier who raised his fist, in every ship that burned across the stars. They had taken one hostage. We had raised an armada. And now we would raise 1,000 more until the Keepers and their gods were nothing but ash.